Larry Hoover is an American former mobster and gang kingpin, as he was known as the founder of the Chicago street gang and gangster disciple. In 1969, Hoover and David Barksdale called a truce on deciding to combine both of their respective rival gangs, Supreme Gangsters and the Black Disciples, together to become the Black Gangster Disciple Nation. In 1974, after the leader of the Black Disciples, David Barksdale, had died of kidney failure stemming from injuries incurring in a 1970 shooting, Hoover took over the reins of the Black Gangster Disciple Nation, and he deemed himself as the chairman of the crew. At the time, though, the Disciples had control of the Chicago South Side turf, and under Hoover's rule, the Black Gangster Disciple Nation took over a majority of the Chicago narcotics trade. Currently, he is serving 6 life sentences in the ADX Florence Prison Facility in Colorado. Apparently, previously to this sentencing, he was sentenced to a life imprisonment of plus 200 years for a 1973 killing. But following a 17-year investigation, turns out there was more under his belt, as he was convicted of conspiracy, extortion, money laundering, and running a continual criminal enterprise from state prison. While Hoover was incarcerated, he ran the gang's illicit narcotics trade both in prison and on the streets, starting from Chicago's west side and then later extending throughout the United States. He then received another life term in 1997, although he has made multiple attempts to have his sentence shortened. As of July 2022, Hoover confirms that he is no longer affiliated with the Gangster Disciples and he wants no part of the gang whatsoever. He also claims that he was no longer the Larry Hoover people sometimes talk about, or he was written about in the papers, or the crimes figure described by the government. Many believe it was just a ruse though for his plan to have his sentence reduced, but either way, appealed. 200 years is wild, but what about 400 years? Harvey Carnigan was arrested in 1975 in the United States, as he is known as the want-to-add killer. On July 31st, 1949, Carnigan killed 58-year-old Laura Showalter during an attempt of a non-consensual physical altercation in the territory of Alaska. In September 16, 1949, he attempted to hurt another woman, Christine Norton, and was arrested the next day. Carnigan was convicted of first-degree killings and physical violations with intent to commit harm, and the jury did not recommend mercy, and instead, he received a mandatory death sentence. However, Carnigan won a new trial on his trial conviction in 1951 on the grounds that his confession was improperly obtained. An officer interrogating Carnigan had told him he would not be executed if he had just confessed to the crime. Carnigan was arrested again on September 24th, 1974, as he was charged with attempted killings and aggravated sodomy. Carnigan pleaded insanity, claiming God had ordered him to kill harlots. As his defense failed, in 1975 he was then found guilty on both charges. After his conviction, Carnigan had a mental evaluation and he was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, and months later he was found guilty of indecent liberty, sodomy upon minors, and 2 additional counts of aggravated sodomy. Carnigan was then sentenced to 400 years, but eventually the sentence was totaled to 60 years in prison. Either way, he died at 95 in prison. He was 95 years old, I meant. In 2013, Ariel Castro was sentenced to not 200, not 400, but 1,000 years, as he pleaded over 937 counts of non-consensual physical aggravation on young women. All whole, he had kidnapped, imprisoned in his home before killing them. His MO was offering the victims a ride, to which he brought them to his home, where they were never seen by anyone else ever again. After the first 2 victims, there were vigils held by the public, to which Ariel had the audacity to attend. In the case of Georgina Lynn DeHoos, where she was missing in 2004, she was on her way home. She was friends with Ariel Castro's daughter, and she thought, well, spending time with my friend wouldn't be a big deal. When DeJesus' mothers confirmed for her to go home, it was Ariel who actually supposed to take her back home, and after a year of her disappearance, the FBI released a sketch of Ariel that would take another 10 years to Jesus and another victim, Michelle Knight, would break free with a child, as one of them was unfortunately impregnated by Castro. And then they were able to escape and send his ass right to jail, send him to jail. After his first court appearance at court, he was told his bail would be set after each kidnapping of $2 million, equaling $8 million in total. Prosecutors sought that the death penalty in addition to the other charges of killings and aggravating harm, but his attorneys of course tried to plead him as not guilty. But in summary, his charge resulted him in life in prison plus 1,000 years, all without parole. Castro fortified his rights to appeal and could not profit in any way due to his crimes. He fortified his assets as well as his house, where he held the victims hostage as it being demolished. He was also fined $100,000, and after all that, he took his own life, not fully facing his crimes in jail. Maopa Cedric Maiki was arrested in December 1997 for the Wemmer Pan killings and was convicted over 100 charges of 27 killings and attempted killings, robberies, and so much more. He was sentenced to 27 life sentences, including 1,159 years and 3 months additional, in a total 1,340 years in prison. The Weimar Pan killings involved several victims, as first were men and women just walking alone who Cedric would just hit with a rock, and the next group of victims were couples in cars where he'd fire weapons on them, and the second criminal profile led to the police in connecting in another crime of victims dying via hammer smash, and realized it's the same guy. He stole a victim's shirt that had his name on it and used that as an alias, and he was caught, placed under custody for his crimes. Later on, while he was in jail, after 1 month he admitted guilt and confessed to the killings.
Let's kick things off with a doozy of a punishment that's been used throughout American history, and that's none other than waterboarding. So this is a form of torment in which water is poured over a cloth covering the face and breathing passages of an immobilized captive, causing the person to experience a sensation of drowning. In the most common method of waterboarding, the captive's face is covered with a cloth or some other thin material, and then they're on their back at an incline of about 10 to 20 degrees, to be specific. Punishers pour water onto the face over the breathing passages, which causes an almost immediate gag reflex and that bad sensation I mentioned a moment ago. So normally water is poured intermittently to prevent death, but if it's poured without interruption, that's death by asphyxia. Not fun. Waterboarding can cause extreme pain, damage to the lungs, brain damage from oxygen deprivation, other physical injuries, possibly broken bones due to struggling against restraints, and overall just lasting psychological damage. Adverse physical effects can last for months, and psychological effects for the rest of your life. Another form of what is considered cruel and unusual punishment in the US of A happens to be sleep deprivation. Not the one you do to yourself. The United States Justice Department released 4 memos in August of 2002 describing interrogation techniques used by the CIA, and claimed that forced sleep deprivation for up to 180 hours, 7.5 days straight, by shackling a diapered prisoner to the ceiling. They were like, oh no, that's not torment. Also, apparently the combination of multiple interrogation methods, including this one, were like, nah. And I think a lot of folks would disagree. While it leaves no physical signs of harm, the United Nations does recognize it as a form of awfulness. Project MKUltra. Now this had the stated goal of developing biological and chemical weapons during the Cold War, but it also secretly dosed a lot of individuals with LSD. Why? They wanted to test the potential for mind control. The project began during a period of what journalist Rupert Cornwell described as paranoia at the CIA, when the US had lost its nuclear monopoly and fear of communism was at its height. Although the practice reportedly continued for 2 decades, it was launched before the big movement of the 60s that made LSD into a popular counterculture symbol. And, oh right, mind control. During the program, the CIA established front companies to work with more than 80 institutions, and in some cases, academic researchers were funded through grants from the CIA front organizations, but they didn't know that the CIA was using their work for these purposes. So, what did the agency do? Well, they ran experiments on subjects, humans, using LSD, hypnosis, and a lot of torment. Many of the human guinea pigs were mental patients, prisoners, addicts, or as one agency put it, people who couldn't fight back. And this wasn't just in the United States. In areas under American control, so Europe, East Asia, Japan, and so forth, the CIA created secret detention centers so the US could avoid criminal prosecution. The CIA captured people suspected of being enemy agents and people they deemed expendable so they could have some fun and learn. Prisoners were interrogated while being administered these fun substances, electroshocked, and subjected to extremes of temperature. Also dealing with sensory isolation, which, yikes. In one case in particular, a patient in Kentucky was dosed continuously for 174 days. So invested in all of this was the CIA that some have labeled the agency responsible for the entire psychedelic movement in the US. At least 2 American deaths can be attributed to this program, according to the Church Committee. And the Church Committee uncovered a lot of this, but at the end of the day, a lot of the top secret files were ordered to be destroyed in 1973 by the director after the Watergate scandal. But there's enough left to confirm one of the wildest and most crazy stories from the history books. And sure, while some folks might be looking at this like, woohoo, free acid. No, this was torment for a lot of people and absolutely awful and ruined their lives. So when most folks think of awful punishments, they often think of scars and wounds. However, inflictors of pain often use methods that are painful and create long-term injuries but without scars. which I know I've already talked about a bit today, but let's talk some more about it. So the use of stress positions is one of these awful methods, and it's pretty common. These positions force a prisoner into a painful physical position, such as forced standing, awkward sitting positions, or suspension of the body for prolonged periods of time. This can lead to long-term or even permanent damage, including nerve, joint, and circulatory damage, and muscle and joint pain. And yep, it's another one of those things on the list of things used by the US government that they technically aren't supposed to do.
Aside Castro, there was Martin John Bryant, who was also receiving life, but not just one time. He got 30 life sentences, an additional 1,652 years, and never to be released. See, Martin spent his life in Australia, where he is from, but even as a child, people noticed he had masochistic tendencies, like pulling off the snorkel of other kids while they were diving, or cutting down trees on a neighbor's property. He was described by teachers as being distant and unemotional, as he was constantly picked on by the other kids. After he was caught tormenting animals and was suspended from school, he returned as he was still needed special help as he was deteriorating academically as well as behaviorally. Even according to PsychoValves, after his case, he had an IQ of 66 and equivalent to an 11-year-old. So what did Martin do? Well, because he was extremely antisocial, the suspicion of wanting attention, Martin, aged 29 at this time, opened fire on civilians, killing 35 and injuring 23. Indiscriminately, in a short time, he eventually got a hostage, who he also ended up killing, resulting him getting arrested and sent to trial. Aside the 1,000 plus years, can you even get sentenced even longer? The answer is yes, of course you can. Hitting at 12 consecutive life sentences and 3,318 years without parole goes to James Egan Holmes. This carrot-top looking Sagittarius was charged for letting off fire and aiming at civilians at a shopping mall center and the movie theater, killing 12, injuring 70, mainly 58 from the shots. It is the deadliest mass killings by a lone perpetrator in history of Colorado and the state's second deadliest mass killings, just after the 1999 Columbine High School massacre. Holmes was arrested minutes later in his car outside the cinema. Later, he had rigged his apartment with homemade explosives and devices as he was hoping the police would get involved and explode. They were actually defused though by the county sheriff's office bomb squad the day after the shooting. Fearing copycat crimes, the movie theaters were actually showing the same film across the United States, increasing their security. Holmes confessed to the shooting but pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. The county prosecutors sought his death penalty, and on August 29th, Holmes was just giving 12 life sentences, one for every person he killed, as well as receiving 3,318 years for the attempted deaths of those wounded and rigging his apartment with explosives. Now you can get 3,318 years plus the 12 sentences seems a lot, but can you get a longer extended amount of time? The answer is yes. Adhan Oktar was a Turkish cult leader who was also acting as a preacher, conspiracy theorist, engaging in massive campaigns, trying to lure Westerners in alternative versions of Islam when it wasn't. He was perverting the actual religion for his own selfish gain, and as a result, he was engaging in criminal gang activity, military espionage, and harm against minors and other charges for, can you guess how many years? It's not 2,000, it's not 4,000, but 8,658 years in prison. Apparently, before his arrest, he made his own book on creation, trying to do lectures on his version of religion to gather more cult following. Even after his arrest, he tried to do it again, where he filed more than 5,000 lawsuits against individuals for defamation, and he is known as a Sunni Zealot by those who knew him, or Sunni Zealot for those who knew him, and even though he denied that's true, I don't know. But since he had a large connection financially, he was actually able to get away with a lot of stuff over the years. It wasn't until the retrial that happened in 2022 was he sentenced to that 8,658 years in prison. Darren Benefold Anderson is a long name to say, but it's also his sentence, as it was also long. In 1994, he was arrested and even noted one of the greatest amount of jail time given as a result of an appeal. Found for his guilty crime of physically harming an elderly woman by non-consensual basis in Tulsa County, including larceny, robbery, and kidnapping, he was sentenced for 2,250 years, which seems fine, but then he tried again to reappeal, only to be reconvicted and resentenced to an additional 9,500 years. In total, Darren received over 11,250 as an official sentence in prison. But considering it's impossible for the average person to live that long, the judge ended up giving him a break and said, okay, you know what, I'll reduce it to 500 years. And I think that's safe to say that's enough time for someone. What do you think? Next, we have an even bigger number, of course, which makes sense to me. How could they even calculate these things? But Jamal Zugam was one of 6 men of an attack on a Madrid train in 2004. He was detained on 13th of March 2004, accusing of multiple counts of killings, attempted killings, stealing a vehicle belonging to a violent organization, and 4 counts of carrying out violent acts. Spain's newspaper reported that 3 witnesses testified to seeing him leave a runsack abroad with one of the trains to explode, specifically one that exploded at Santa Eugenia's station. The attack resulted in killing 193 people, injuring about 2,050. According to the History of Spain, it was one of their deadliest attacks since since 1988. On the 31st of October 2007, he was convicted of 191 charges of killings and 1,856 charges of attempted killings, receiving a sentence of, are you ready? 42,922 years of confinement. A Spaniard, Emilio Suarez Tojoras, who supplied the dynamite in return for the narcotics, was also sentenced to a similar sentence of 34,715 years. And finally, this one wasn't that bad in comparison to the others, like in regards to killings or attacks. This was just different. This was about money. Apparently, the cause of this crime was so egregious it resulted in the biggest sentencing so far in history. Chamoy Tipiaso was sentenced for 141,078 years. Why? Because of a pyramid scheme. But it wasn't just any ordinary pyramid scheme, it was a fraud case that led more than 16,000 Thai citizens affected that have an estimate of $200 million to $301 million. In the late 1960s, Chamoy started the chit fund called the Mae Chamoy Fund, which was made to look like an oil share with high returns. Due to her connections with the Royal Thai Air Force, the Petroleum Authority of Thailand, the fund was able to sustain itself for a remarkably long time. Her connections to the military was a huge factor in political and business power, and so it's apparent its military backing made the scheme seem legitimate. The scheme drew over 16,231 clients and was to not shut down until the mid-1980s. The fund had a large number of politically powerful investors from the military and even the royal household, and such, there was calls for the government to bail out the banks and chit funds. After discussion with the king, the nature of which was not made public, the fund was shut down and Chamoy was arrested. She was held by secret by the Air Force for several days, and her trial was not held until after the losses of the military and royal personnel involved in being recovered. On July 27, 1989, Chamoy and 7 accomplices were convicted of the corporate fraud, and she was sentenced out of a total 141,078 years of life imprisonment sentence in prison. But Thai law at the time stated that the maximum sentence could only be up to 20, so she was reduced twice. And she was released in 1993, and the wackiest sentencing, I think, takes the cake in history. Number 10, Bloody Monday. Although the Boomtown Rats wrote a song called I Hate Mondays based off of the killings of a 16-year-old girl named Brenda Ann Spencer, who targeted young students at an elementary school playground, which again another crime in the US that shocked many people, another Monday brought dark history but was forgotten as it was buried by other crimes and violence that echoed in the United States. Bloody Monday was a series of riots on August 6, 1855 in Louisville, Kentucky, and this was during an election day when Protestant mobs attacked Irish and German Catholic neighborhoods. These riots grew out of the bitter rivalry between the Democrats and the nativist Know Nothing Party. Multiple street fights raged, leaving 22 people dead, scores injured, and much property destroyed by fire. 5 people were later indicted, but none were actually convicted. The victims were not compensated. In this time, like other major cities on the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, Louisville grew rapidly in the previously 2 decades because of heavy immigration from Ireland and Germany. By the time the violence ensued and the bloodshed was over, more than 100 businesses, private homes, and tenements had been vandalized, looted, and/or burned, including a block-long row of houses known as Quinn's Row. Historians estimated roughly the 22 people had died, but Catholics noted over 100, as there were also entire families who were consumed by the fires in their homes. Number 9, Rock Springs. Rock Springs sounds like a nice spa with self-care treatments, but when it comes to American history, we forgot to add the word massacre at the end of those 2 words. Yes, the Rock Spring Massacre is a reflection of the many discriminations and exclusions into results of violence of different ethnicities in the United States. The riot and resulting massacre of immigrant Chinese miners by white immigrant miners was the result of racial prejudice towards the Chinese miners who were perceived to be taking the jobs from the white miners. The Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 suspended Chinese immigration for 10 years, but not before thousands of immigrants came to the American West. Most Chinese immigrants to Wyoming Territory took jobs at the railroad at first, but many ended up employed by the coal mines owned by the Union Pacific Railroad. As Chinese immigration increased, so did anti-Chinese sentiment on the parts of the whites, as anti-Chinese rhetoric and violence were more prevalent among the western chapters of the Knights, a group of white supremacy-focused order, and in 1880, San Francisco Knights wrote regarding the Chinese, "They bear the semblance of men but live like beasts who eats rice and the offal of the slaughterhouse," which as someone who loves rice, that's kinda rude. The article also calls Chinese natural thieves in quotes and stated that Chinese women are night walkers, if you get what I'm saying. However, this wouldn't be the first nor the last time of violence against the Chinese, which brings us to number 8. Number 8, the Los Angeles Chinese Massacre of 1871. The Los Angeles Chinese Massacre of 1871 was a racial massacre targeting Chinese immigrants in Los Angeles, California, United States, that occurred on October 24, 1871. Approximately 500 white and Latino Americans attacked, harassed, robbed, and killed the ethnic Chinese residents in what is today referred to as Old Chinatown neighborhood. The mob gathered after hearing the policeman and a rancher had been killed as a result of a conflict between rival Tongs, the Ninyang and Hongqiao, as news of their death spreads across the city, fueling rumors that the Chinese community were killing quote-unquote white wholesale. 19 Chinese immigrants were killed, 15 of them of whom were hung by the mob in the course of the riot. At least one was mutilated when a member of the mob cut off a finger and obtaining the victim's diamond ring. Those killed represented over 10% of the small Chinese population of Los Angeles at the time, which was numbered at 172 prior to the massacre. 10 men of the mob were prosecuted and 8 were convicted of the manslaughter, and these convictions were overturned and appealed due to technicalities. Number 7. Hamburg Massacre. Of course, with the US, we must talk about another massacre, as it seems to be so prevalent on the land. During the Reconstruction era, there was an infamous riot known as the Hamburg Massacre or Red Shirt Massacre. Leading up to the last election season of the Reconstruction era, it was the first of a series of civil disturbances planned and carried out by white Democrats in the majority black Republican Edgefield district, with the goal of suppressing black American civil rights and voting rights and disrupting Republican meetings through actual and threatened violence. Beginning with the dispute over free passage on a public road, the massacre was rooted in racial hatred and political motives. A court hearing attracted armed white rifle clubs, also known as the Red Shirts, who might later merge into the Triple Ks. Desiring to regain control of state governments and eradicate the civil rights of black Americans, over 100 white men attacked about 30 black servicemen of the National Guard at the Armory, killing 2 as they tried to leave that night. Later that night, the Red Shirts tormented and killed 4 of the militia while holding them as prisoners and wounded several others. In total, the events in Hamburg resulted in the death of 1 white man and 6 black men, with several more black individuals being wounded. Although 94 white men were indicted for the killings of the coronary jury, none were prosecuted. Number 6. Charleston. Yes, when it comes to violence against minorities and people of color, the US seems to be pretty adamant with that. In tying into more recent historical events, as this is also part of history, reflecting on number 7 is in number 6 with the unfortunate Charleston church shooting. Although this occurrence happened in 2015, the result of its hate crime was in a reflection of anti-blackness which took place in Charleston, South Carolina. 9 people were killed and the 10th was injured. The crime took place during the Bible study at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, one of the oldest black churches in the southern United States. Among the fatalities was the senior pastor, state senator, and at the time was noted as the deadliest mass violence that took place at a place of worship in the US history. Dylan Roof, who was the guilty party as he was 21 years old at the time, committing said crime, with images of him holding racist propaganda and posting a manifesto of his ambitions. After he was arrested, he later confessed that he committed the violence in hopes of igniting a race war, as well as according to his roommate, Roof expressed his support for racial segregation in the United States and he wanted to start a civil war. Okay. On December 15th, 2016, Roof was convicted in federal court of all 33 federal charges and is currently awaiting the death penalty.
Time to go back in time to witch trials, specifically witch trial cakes. Sadly, these aren't yummy Halloween cakes, but instead a bizarre form of counter magic, quote unquote, a supernatural dessert that was used to identify suspected evildoers. In cases of mysterious illness or possession, witch hunters would take a sample of the victim's urine, mix it with rye meal and ashes, and bake it into a cake. Now, this stomach-turning concoction was then fed to a familiar or animal helper of the suspected witch because they wanted to pray that the creature would fall under its spell, reveal the name of the guilty sorcerer. During the hysteria that preceded the Salem witch trials, Tituba famously helped prepare a witch cake to identify the person responsible for bewitching somebody. The brew failed to work, and the knowledge of spells and folk remedies that Tituba had was later used as evidence against her because they were like, you've got to be a witch for knowing this. One more thing, another use for a witch cake came from burning the pastry in hopes that the scorching heat would transfer to the witch and force her to reveal herself. But at the end of all this, the harm against animals? That's punishment enough and awful. Ever heard about a ducking chair? Not to be confused with a cucking chair, which is a whole other concept, or the red hot stools women accused of having naughty acts that the devil would have to sit on. Whole thing. Sadly, not enough information is out there to unpack all of that, but let's keep moving. The ducking stool was a strongly made wooden armchair, often made out of oak, in which the offender was seated, with an iron band being placed around them so they would not fall out during their immersion. The earliest record of the use of such is towards the beginning of the 17th century, and it was used in Europe, but also in the United States, and it was quite something. So usually this chair would be fastened to a long wooded beam, kind of like a seesaw, at the edge of a pond or a river. I'm sure you can see where this is going. Sometimes the ducking stool was not a fixture, but instead was mounted on a pair of wooden wheels, so that it could be wheeled through the streets. And at the river edge, it was just hanging by a chain. In sentencing a woman, the magistrates would order the number of duckings she should have. And as much as I've scoured the internet, there's some data missing on the numbers. The type of ducking stool was called a tumbrel, and this was a chair on 2 wheels with 2 long shafts fixed to the axles. This would be pushed into a pond, and then the shafts would be released, ergo tipping the chair up backwards. Sometimes this punishment proved fatal, and subjects would die. Once again, the sometimes should be taken with a pound of salt. Way back when, ducking was used as a way to establish whether somebody was a witch or not. So the ducking stools were used for this purpose, but then later you could do this without the chair. So in that instance, you would bind the subject's right thumb to your left big toe, and then you tie a rope around the waist of the accused and throw them into a pond. If you float, then you're in league with the devil. You're rejecting the baptismal water. And if you sink, you're clear. Oh, and you're also dead. We all know about gas chambers. They're an apparatus for killing humans or other animals with gas, consisting of a sealed chamber where you've got the poisonous or asphyxiant gas, and a lot of different gases can be used: hydrogen cyanide, carbon monoxide, and so forth and so on. So while this is more so associated with deaths in Germany during a certain time period, it's actually been used as a form of end-of-life torment in the States. And it's still legal in places like Arizona, Missouri, and Wyoming. The last person to meet their end by it was Walter Legrand in Arizona in 1999, but it could technically still be used today if requested. Going back in history, there were some awful ways that a lot of Americans punished their own servants. Some accounts describe how different methods of punishment and harm became popular in the States, and William W. Brown discussed a common practice used in Virginia from an owner who had his property bound and lashed in the smokehouse. Then he created a fire from tobacco stems to suffocate and smoke the people as further punishment. Slaves are often expected to work in exceptionally difficult physical conditions, especially outside, and in theory, it would make sense for their bodies to be protected and maintained. Well, in cases where folks didn't meet what owners wanted them to meet, or they resisted, they would lose some body parts. Sometimes it involved cutting off an ear. Sometimes it would just be a slice of the flesh. More severe examples included amputation, gouging, sometimes even cutting hamstrings or castrating. In a lot of cases, folks wouldn't receive medical treatment, and that's the end of it for them. And finally, the upright jerker was an interesting twist on a classic end-of-life method. Rope necklacing, while it is a true standby, leaves much to be desired in terms of effectiveness. Depending on a lot of factors, it could be a very slow or awkward way to go. So how did folks get around this? Do it backwards. The upright jerker was a modified system that used heavy weights and pulleys to quickly jerk the condemned back into the air. Folks were hoping this would be more effective. Yeah, it didn't work.
Number 5, Know Nothing Riot. I know about nothing as much nothing knows about me, but somehow, some who may not know, the Know Nothing movement was a natives political movement in the United States in the mid-1850s. The national political organization, also known as the Know Nothing, was officially known as the Native American Party prior to 1855. Thereafter, it is simply known as the American Party. Members of the movement were required to say, "I know nothing," whenever they were asked about specifics by outsiders, providing the group with its name. Mainly composed of Protestants, they had a huge resentment against Catholics and opened up what would be the Know Nothing riots, which apparently had a lot of riots throughout the years of 1844 to 1858. In the 5 months leading to the riots, nativist groups had been spreading false rumors that Catholics were trying to remove the Bible from public schools. Really, Catholics out of all people? Because of this rumor, it opened a chain reaction of violence against the Catholic community, especially the Irish Catholics that immigrated there. In relation to our number 10, Bloody Monday, it also was in association against the Irish as well as German immigrants who are also Catholic at the time. Number 4, the Greek Town Riot. Well, in US history, if you're an immigrant, you're bound to experience violence, especially in the past, but even now they'll do it at your face or even through small microaggressions that make you feel really small and confused. Another unknown crime committed in the US that not many might know about is the Greek Town Riot. In Nebraska on February 21st, 1909, several Greeks were wounded and injured when a mob of 3,000 men displaced some of the population of Greektown. They also wrecked buildings there and of course started a riot. They looted homes and businesses while physically harming Greeks as well as Italians and Romanians who they misidentified as Greeks. According to some sources, a 14-year-old Greek boy was killed, although other sources stated that nobody was killed. The entire Greek population of South Omaha was warned to leave the city within 1 day or risk the ongoing wrath of the mob. During the violence, the South Omaha police did not or could not control the mob, and they asked help from the police in Omaha, which was a separate city at the time, but the police there decided not to join in. Why did this all happen? Well, because a 36-year-old man named John Massacres was taking English lessons from a 17-year-old girl, and he was accused of advancing onto her. Eventually, after the riot, John was put on trial, where he was sentenced to death after his sentencing. He was also denied a fair trial and was charged for the second degree after he fired a weapon at a man who was trying to kill him for the accusation on the 17-year-old girl. Number 3, Rodney King. In some way, this crime may not be known, but if you're a local in Los Angeles and was around in 1991, you might definitely remember. 3 police officers were acquitted after the savage beatings of Rodney King, an African-American man. According to the reports, the chase began after King, who was intoxicated, was caught speeding on the freeway by a Californian highway patrol cruiser, but he refused to pull over. When the police brutality ensued, it captured the vile language and attacks on Rodney Rodney, and when the violence was captured by George Holliday, the footage sparked massive outrage, and even more so when subsequent riots were triggered by the acquittal of the officers involved. As a result of several days of rioting, more than 50 people were killed, more than 2,300 were injured, and thousands were arrested. About 1,100 buildings were damaged, and total property damage was about $1 billion, which makes it the riots of one of the most devastating civil disruptions in American history. However, the events brought to the forefront concerns about racism and police brutality with the LAPD, as well as police brutality as a whole. But it wouldn't be until 2020 when another incident of violence caused by the police on George Floyd sparked another outcry on the lack of justice caused by law enforcement. And so many others since then remained unnoticed, like Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin, Breonna Taylor, and so many more, all the names that will never be forgotten. Number 2, Tulsa. The Tulsa Race Massacre, also known as the Tulsa Race Riot or the Black Wall Street Massacre, was a 2-day-long white supremacist terrorist massacre that took place between May 31st and June 1st, 1921, when mobs of white residents, some of whom had been appointed as deputies and armed by city government officials, attacked black residents and destroyed homes and businesses of the Greenwood district in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The event is considered one of the most worst incidents of racial violence in American history, and the attackers burned and destroyed more than 35 square blocks of the neighborhood at the time, one of the wealthiest black communities in the United States, also known as Black Wall Street. In Don't Let Them Bury My Story, Viola Fletcher, a 109-year-old woman, as the last survivor of the Tulsa Massacre, recalls the horrific night in 1921. Viola Fletcher can still vividly remember the smell of her thriving neighborhood burning. She was only 7 years old when the massacre happened, and states in her book, quote, "You know, I can still smell the smoke, the burning. I remember the bodies, all the black bodies in the street. The sound of the guns, they didn't stop, and I can still hear them. I haven't forgotten that. I can't forget that. You can't forget. It doesn't go away." End quote. Thankfully, with activists and historians giving Viola a platform to tell her story, her book, as I mentioned, Don't Let Them Bury My Story, allows her to speak on her experiences of brutality and malice of that time. But like in Childish Gambino, This Is America, the trial and hearing for the massacre delayed her ruling on the defendant's motions to dismiss the case. But either way, her story isn't dismissed, for the people will forever know the truth. Number 1, the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears was an ethnic cleansing and forced displacement of approximately 60,000 people of the 5 civil tribes between 1830 and 1850 by the United States government. The process of cultural transformation of their traditional ways of life towards a white American way of life as proposed by George Washington and Henry Knox was gaining momentum, especially through the Cherokee and Choctaw. Although Jackson was not the sole or original architect of removal policy, his contributions were influential to its trajectory. Jackson supported of the removal of the Indians began as at least a decade before in his presidency. Indian removal was Jackson's top legislative priority upon taking office. After being elected president, he wrote in his first address to Congress, "The immigration should be voluntary, for it would be cruel as unjust to compel the Aborigines to abandon the graves of their fathers and seek a home in a distant land, as if any of it was voluntary." Even for some scholars, they labeled the displacement as genocidal acts, as historian Jeffrey Alsler argues that when genocide was not unequivocally carried out, the threat of genocide was used to ensure natives' compliances with removal policies, and concluded that, in quote, "in its outcome and the means of use to gain compliance, the policy had genocidal dimensions." Like the Nakba in 1948 and 2023 in Palestine, displacement of any indigenous people in general is a crime.